It was 3:30 in the morning, the kind of darkness that feels heavy, the kind that swallows sound and light and secrets. On the 12th 200 block of Kelly Drive, the only thing moving was the wind off the water and a black four-door sedan tearing down the asphalt. This wasn't a joyride. The engine was screaming, pushed to a limit that said panic, or purpose, or perhaps a little bit of both. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a drunk driver losing control, a tragedy waiting to happen. But in the underworld and in the precincts that monitored it, there are no accidents at 3:30 a.m. There are only messages and disposals. This car was a disposal. Inside was a man who knew too much, a man who called Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson a friend, and behind him, or perhaps waiting for him, were the people who decided that a river was better than a cell, that a drowning was cleaner than a trial. The car hit the barrier, or maybe it didn't even try to turn. It launched. For a split second, 2 tons of steel and glass hung in the air, suspended in the black void between the road and the Schuylkill River. Then, gravity took over. The splash was violent, a massive displacement of water that echoed off the Girard Avenue Bridge, shattering the silence of the park. And then, almost as quickly as it had happened, the river began to swallow the evidence. The water of the Schuylkill is unforgiving at night. It is murky, cold, and moves with a deceptive current. As the black sedan began to sink, the plan seemed perfect. This was how you erase someone. You put them in a car, you put the car in the water, and you let the silt and the mud do the rest. By the time the sun came up, the roof would be submerged, the ripples would be gone, and the man inside would be just another missing person in a city full of them. It was a tactic as old as the mob itself, a tactic used by corrupt officers and gangsters alike. No body, no crime. No crime, no investigation. It was supposed to be a tomb. But the people who sent that car into the water, the people who watched from the bridge or the banks, they made one mistake. One tiny, mechanical, catastrophic mistake. And in the world of Bumpy Johnson, where survival depended on noticing the things everyone else missed, one mistake is all it takes to bring the whole house of cards crashing down. That mistake wasn't about the car, or the location, or the time of night. It was about a window. To understand why a single open window changed the course of history for the Harlem underworld, you have to understand the physics of a sinking car. When a vehicle hits the water with the windows rolled up, it becomes a bubble. The air trapped inside keeps it buoyant for a few seconds, maybe a minute, but it also seals the fate of anyone trapped inside. The pressure of the water against the doors makes them impossible to open. The air runs out. The water seeps in. It is a slow, terrifying, and certain death. That is what was intended for Bumpy Johnson's associate. A sealed metal coffin at the bottom of the river. But when the recovery crews finally arrived hours later, when the divers went down into the murk and the tow trucks winched the dripping, muddy wreck onto the bank, they saw it immediately. The driver's side window was down, not broken, not shattered by the impact, rolled down. That open window changed the physics. It allowed water to rush in immediately, sure, dragging the car down faster. But it also created a portal, an exit, a way out for a man who was fighting for his life in the pitch-black freezing water. And when the police opened the doors, when they shone their flashlights into the back seat and the front seat, expecting to find a bloated, waterlogged corpse, they found nothing. No body, no driver. The car was empty. No one was found inside. The police spokesman would later say, his voice tight, his eyes shifting away from the cameras. The report stated that they couldn't tell 100% if someone was in there when it was underwater, but on the shoreline, the truth was undeniable. The tomb was empty. The ghost had walked, or rather, swam away. And for the corrupt cops who had orchestrated this drop, that empty seat was more terrifying than any dead body could ever be. Because a dead man can't talk. A dead man can't go back to Bumpy Johnson and tell him exactly who was driving the chase car. A dead man can't testify. But a man who swims out of a river at 3:45 a.m., he is a loose end. He is a witness. He is a declaration of war. This incident, this river job, wasn't just a botched execution. It was a symptom of a much larger disease that plagued New York and its surrounding territories in the mid-20th century. It was the disease of unchecked power, where the line between the law and the outlaw wasn't just blurred, it was non existent. To understand the weight of that empty car, we have to travel back from the banks of the Schuylkill to the streets of Harlem. We have to understand the man whose shadow loomed over every policy bank, every corner boy, and every corrupt precinct captain in the city. We have to understand Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy, the man who didn't make mistakes, or at least tried not to. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. In the 1930s and 40s, he was an institution. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, and raised in the bubbling cauldron of the Harlem Renaissance, Bumpy was a contradiction wrapped in a bespoke suit. He was a pimp, a thief, a burglar, and a killer. He was always armed, always ready to resort to violence to get what he wanted. But he was also a poet, a man who read history and philosophy in solitary confinement. A man who could quote Shakespeare while breaking a man's jaw. His rise to power began under the tutelage of Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madame Queen of Harlem. St. Clair was a force of nature, a woman who ran the numbers racket, the policy game, which was essentially a massive, community-run lottery for the poor residents of Harlem, who were denied loans by white banks and ignored by white insurance companies. The numbers game was their stock market. It was their economy, and it was lucrative, so lucrative that it attracted the attention of the white mob. Enter Dutch Schultz, the Dutchman, a violent, erratic, beer baron of the Prohibition era who decided that Harlem's money should be his money. In the early 1930s, Schultz moved in, using extreme violence to take over the numbers rackets. He beat operators, kidnapped runners, and murdered anyone who stood in his way. Most of the Harlem bosses folded. They paid tribute. They bowed down. But not Stephanie St. Clair, and definitely not Bumpy Johnson. Together, they waged a war that is still talked about in the barber shops on 125th Street. It was a futile but fierce war against the organized crime factions of New York. Over 40 murders were attributed to this conflict. Think about that number, 40 bodies, 40 funerals, 40 families destroyed. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a siege. Bumpy Johnson was the general of this resistance. He organized a guerrilla army of Harlem toughs. They knew the rooftops, the alleyways, the basements. When Schultz's men came uptown, they found themselves walking into ambushes. They found their cars rigged, their collections stolen, their enforcers disappearing. Bumpy didn't just fight with guns, he fought with strategy. He understood that Schultz was a businessman, albeit a murderous one. He made the cost of doing business in Harlem so high, in blood and treasure, that it became unsustainable. Eventually, the war ended, as all wars do, with a treaty. Schultz was assassinated, not by Bumpy, but by his own Italian associates who considered him a liability. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had stood toe to toe with the Dutchman, cut a deal with Lucky Luciano. The Italians would run the wholesale banking of the numbers, but the operations, the streets, and the employment would remain in Harlem's hands. Bumpy would be the kingpin, the interface between the black community and the Italian syndicate. This arrangement lasted for 4 decades. It made Bumpy Johnson rich. It made him powerful. But it also put a target on his back that never truly went away. The police, especially the policy squads, tasked with cracking down on illegal gambling, viewed Bumpy not as a criminal to be arrested, but as a rival power center to be neutralized. They couldn't buy him. He had more money than they did. They couldn't scare him. He had survived Dutch Schultz and Alcatraz. So they harassed him. They surveilled him. And sometimes they went after the people close to him. This is the context of the river incident. The man in that car wasn't just a random driver. He was a piece of Bumpy Johnson's infrastructure. Taking him out was a way to hurt Bumpy, to blind him, to cut off a limb without attacking the head directly. It was a cowardly move, done in the dark, utilizing the cover of a traffic accident. Driving into the river, they would call it. A tragedy. Lost control on a curve, but Bumpy knew better. He knew that professional drivers don't drive into rivers at 3:30 a.m. unless they are forced off the road or dead at the wheel. When the news reached him that the car had been found, Bumpy didn't rage. He didn't flip tables. He asked one question. The same question that would haunt the precinct for years. Did they find a body? When the answer came back, no. Bumpy Johnson smiled. A cold, terrifying smile. Because he knew what that open window meant. He knew about the mistake. And he knew that the game had just changed. The police had tried to play by the rules of the street, but they had forgotten the most important rule of all. If you come at the king, or the king's men, you better not miss. And if you drop a man in a river, you better make sure the window is up. The investigation that followed was a farce, a piece of theater performed for the public while the real investigation happened in the shadows. The official police report, as detailed in news footage from the time, stated that crews searched for hours, diving in and using boats. They brought in a heavy, duty tow truck to haul the dripping chassis up the embankment. The reporters were there, cameras flashing, waiting for the grim shot of a body bag being zipped up. No one was found inside. The reporter Katie Catra would say, standing on the banks of the Schuylkill. She noted the unanswered questions and the bizarre situation unfolding. But for the police on the scene, specifically those who knew the backstory, it wasn't bizarre. It was a catastrophe. Imagine the scene on the riverbank. The sun is just coming up, casting a gray, flat light over the water. The crane whines as it lifts the black sedan. Water cascades out of the door jambs. The tires spin listlessly in the air. The officers are gathering around, notebooks out, feigning ignorance. Must have swum away, one suggests. Maybe nobody was in it. Maybe it rolled in neutral. Another offers. But they know. They know someone was driving. Witnesses had seen the car flying down Kelly Drive. You don't drive a ghost car at 60 miles per hour. The one window down detail was the detail that betrayed them. It suggested agency. It suggested that in the final seconds before the plunge, or perhaps immediately after impact, the occupant had the presence of mind to crank that handle, to open the escape route. For Bumpy Johnson, this missing associate was a weapon. As long as the body was missing, the cops couldn't close the file, but they also couldn't rest. Every shadow could be the associate coming back for revenge. Every phone call could be the Internal Affairs Division asking questions. Bumpy used this paranoia. He let the rumors swirl. He let the word get out on the street that his friend was alive, that he was safe, that he was talking. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The threat of the truth was enough to make the corrupt officers sweat. It was a psychological tactic, a game of chess played with human pieces. And Bumpy was a grandmaster. This ability to outthink the law was Bumpy's trademark. He wasn't just a thug, he was an intellectual. During his stints in prison, and there were many, he spent almost half his life behind bars by his 30th birthday. He didn't just lift weights. He read. He wrote poetry. Some of his poems were even published during the Harlem Renaissance. Can you imagine? A man who could slit a throat with a straight razor and then go back to his cell and write a sonnet about the sorrow of the black man in America. This duality terrified the establishment. They could understand a brute. They could beat a brute. But a poet, Gangster, a man who understood history and politics. That was dangerous. That was a man who could lead a movement. And lead he did. Not a civil rights movement in the traditional sense, but a movement of defiance. Bumpy Johnson walked through Harlem like a feudal lord. He helped the impoverished. He gave cash and gifts to the community. He paid rents. He bought turkeys on Thanksgiving. He was the government for people who had been failed by the government. So when the police attacked his inner circle, they weren't just attacking a criminal organization. They were attacking the community's benefactor. The river incident was seen by Harlem not as a rightful law enforcement action, but as another example of Ra-ist cops trying to destroy a black man who stood tall. The term Ra-ist cops isn't used lightly here. The NYPD of the mid-20th century was notorious for its racial bias. The blue wall of silence was impenetrable, and for black officers, it was a gauntlet of discrimination. For black citizens, it was an occupation. Officers were known to drop suspects off in rival gang territory or beat them in station basements or, yes, drive them to the river. Antoinette James, a Detroit police officer who wrote about her experiences behind the badge, described the blue code of silence as something that bled beyond the badge into politics and the church, challenging faith and focus. While her story is from a later era, the roots of this culture were deep and rotten in Bumpy's time. The idea that a black man, even a criminal, had rights was a foreign concept to many on the force. So, when the black sedan went into the river, it was business as usual. Until the window was found down. Until the car came up empty. That was the moment the balance of power shifted. That was the one mistake. And Bumpy Johnson was not the kind of man to let a mistake go unpunished. He began to apply pressure. Not with guns, not initially, but with presence. He would show up at the precinct. He would stand on the corner where the officers walked their beat, just watching them. Silent. Imposing. A reminder that he knew what they had done. He was using their own fear against them. This escalated in December 1965. Frustrated by the constant police surveillance that had plagued him since the river incident and other clashes, Bumpy staged a sit-down strike at a police station. Picture this. The most feared gangster in New York walks into the lion's den. He refuses to leave. He sits in a chair, folds his arms, and dares them to arrest him. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station, a charge so flimsy it was laughable. He was later acquitted by a judge. This act of defiance was legendary. It was Bumpy saying, "I am not hiding in the shadows. I am right here, and you cannot touch me." It was a victory that humiliated the department. It proved that the man they tried to drown, metaphorically and literally, could swim. But Bumpy wasn't fighting this battle alone. In the background of this criminal saga was a deepening friendship with another giant of Harlem's, Malcolm X. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X is one of the most fascinating and under-discussed alliances in American history. On the surface, they were opposites. Malcolm was the Prince of Islam, a man of rigid morality who preached against drugs, alcohol, and the very vices that Bumpy profited from. Bumpy was the godfather, the king of the underworld. But beneath the surface, they were brothers in arms. They both hated the systemic racism that suffocated their people. They both believed in black self-determination, and they both had a healthy distrust of the police. Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson were best friends. This isn't just Hollywood fiction, it's historical fact. Bumpy provided security for Malcolm when the Nation of Islam turned against him. He offered his soldiers to protect the minister when the police refused to do so. In return, Malcolm tried to steer Bumpy toward a new path. He wanted Bumpy to go legit, to stop harming the community and start building it up. The river incident and the constant threat of police violence was a catalyst for these conversations. Malcolm argued that as long as Bumpy was in the life, he was vulnerable. He was giving the enemy a reason to destroy him. "Get out of the game, Bumpy," Malcolm would say. "Use your mind. Use your power for the movement." And Bumpy listened. He respected Malcolm more than any man alive. He saw in Malcolm the potential for a future where black men didn't have to carry guns to walk down the street. But old habits die hard, and the streets have a gravity that is hard to escape. Bumpy knew that if he stepped down, someone worse would step up. Someone without his code. Someone without his restraint. He was the dam holding back a flood of chaos. And he was right. Because waiting in the wings, watching, learning, and plotting was the next generation. A generation that didn't care about poetry or community or codes of honor. A generation embodied by a young man from North Carolina named Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was everything Bumpy was not. He was flashy. He was reckless. He was hungry in a way that was dangerous. Lucas claimed to be Bumpy's driver, his right-hand man, though historians debate the extent of this relationship. But Lucas certainly studied Bumpy. He watched how the old man moved. He saw how Bumpy commanded respect without raising his voice. But Lucas missed the most important lesson. He missed the lesson of the open window. He didn't understand that the mistake that saves you is the mistake you don't make. Bumpy taught that the loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. He taught that invisibility was a superpower. If the cops don't see you, they can't drop you in a river. If they don't know what you have, they can't take it. Bumpy Johnson wore conservative suits. He lived quietly. He drove modest cars. He was a shadow. Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas wanted to be the sun. He wanted the shine. And that desire for attention, that inability to stay in the shadows, would eventually lead to his own one mistake. But that was years away. In the aftermath of the river incident, Bumpy was still the king. He was still the man who could make a phone call and have a precinct captain transferred. He was still the man who could look a judge in the eye and walk away a free man. The survival of the associate in the river was a testament to Bumpy's power, even if it was just a stroke of luck. It reinforced the legend that Bumpy's people were untouchable, that they had angels watching over them, or perhaps devils. The police began to whisper that you couldn't kill Bumpy's men. They came back. They haunted you. And Bumpy, sitting in his office at the Teresa Hotel, reading his poetry, watching the streets below, let them believe it. He knew that fear was a better protector than any gun. But the tragedy of the streets is that luck eventually runs out. The one mistake, philosophy cuts both ways. The cops made a mistake at the river, and Bumpy won. But the world was changing. The 1960s were bringing a new kind of heat. The federal government was getting involved. The drug game was shifting from numbers to heroin, a darker, deadlier trade. And the alliances that held Harlem together were fraying. The assassination of Malcolm X in February 1965 was the beginning of the end for Bumpy's era. When Malcolm died, a part of Bumpy died with him. The actor Forrest Whitaker, who played Bumpy in Godfather of Harlem, described the profound grief Bumpy felt. With his best friend gone, we embark on a new journey that Malcolm X wanted us to do. Whitaker noted, Bumpy had lost his moral compass, his intellectual partner. He was alone in a world that was becoming increasingly unrecognizable. The river incident stood as a marker of the old days, days when the battle was physical, local, and manageable. But the new war was different. It was political, it was global, and it was ruthless. As Bumpy stood over the body of Malcolm X, he must have realized that the rules had changed. The open window wouldn't save them this time. The enemy wasn't just dropping bodies in rivers anymore. They were gunning down leaders in ballrooms in front of their children. This loss hardened Bumpy. It made him cynical. If the prince could be killed, what hope was there for a gangster? He retreated further into his fortress, trying to hold on to a Harlem that was slipping through his fingers. He watched as the drugs, heroin specifically, began to flood the streets, a poison he had tried to control but could no longer stop. And he watched as Frank Lucas began to rise, ready to take the crown and wear it with an arrogance that would eventually bring the whole kingdom down. The story of the river, of the raised cops and the empty car, is a prelude to this fall. It is the moment where the cracks in the system became visible. It showed that the police were fallible, that they were sloppy, and that they could be beaten. But it also showed the precariousness of life in the underworld. One turn of a window crank. That was the difference between life and death, between a legend and a statistic. As we delve deeper into this story, we must look at the forensics of that night on Kelly Drive. We must understand exactly what happened when that car hit the water. Because the devil, as Bumpy Johnson knew better than anyone, is in the details. And the detail of the open window is the key to unlocking the entire mystery of how Bumpy Johnson defeated the police without ever firing a shot. To truly grasp the magnitude of the one mistake, that open window on the black Sedan, we must step away from the abstract and into the mechanical reality of 1950s automotive engineering and the physiological terror of drowning. When the police plotted to drop Bumpy Johnson's associate into the Schuylkill River, they were relying on the technology of the time to serve as a coffin. Cars in that era were heavy. They were made of thick steel, chrome, and glass. They were not designed to float. A 1950s sedan weighs upwards of 4,000 pounds. When it leaves the road and hits the surface of a river, the impact is like hitting concrete. The officers involved in the river job counted on a specific sequence of events. Phase 1, the car hits the water. Phase 2, the weight of the engine block, located in the front, pulls the nose down immediately. Phase 3, the water pressure against the doors seals them shut. In a car submerged even a few feet, the pressure differential makes opening a door humanly impossible. You would need the strength of a hydraulic press to push it open against the weight of the river. This is the tum effect. The occupant is trapped in an air bubble that is slowly, inevitably replaced by freezing, murky water. It is a silent, invisible execution. But the driver, Bumpy's associate, knew the game. Or perhaps, in the frantic moments of the chase down Kelly Drive, amidst the adrenaline and the terror, survival instinct took over. He did the one thing that counteracts the Tom effect. He rolled down the window. It sounds counterintuitive. Why let the water in? Why speed up the sinking? But any diver, any survival expert, and apparently any high-ranking Harlem soldier knows that equalization is the only way out. By rolling the window down before impact, or immediately upon hitting the water, the driver allowed the river to flood the cabin instantly. This was terrifying. Imagine the cold, black water rushing in, hitting you in the chest, filling your nose and mouth. But this influx of water equalized the pressure. With the pressure inside the car equal to the pressure outside, the door could be opened. Or, even easier, the driver could simply swim out through the open window. When the police crews arrived at 3:45 a.m., they were looking for a sealed car. They were looking for a clean job. The Action News report mentions that crews searched for hours, diving in and by boat. Why search for hours if the car is right there? Because they were looking for a body that had likely floated downstream or climbed up the bank miles away. When the tow truck finally winched the vehicle out and the water drained from the floorboards, the open window was a screaming accusation. It told the forensic story of an escape. It meant that the victim was loose. This created a specific kind of panic within the corrupt policy squad. The policy squads were specialized units within the NYPD and surrounding departments tasked with breaking up the numbers racket. In reality, many of them were tax collectors. They collected bribes from the bankers and controllers. If you paid, you operated. If you didn't pay, or if you became too arrogant, they raided you. But Bumpy Johnson's organization was different. They didn't just pay, they negotiated. And sometimes they refused. The officers who drove that sedan into the river were likely acting on orders to eliminate a problem. Someone who perhaps refused to increase the bribe, or someone who had witnessed a police crime. By failing to verify the death, they had created a ghost. In the intelligence world, a ghost is an operator who exists but cannot be found. In the Harlem Underworld, the ghost of the associate became a legend. Stories began to circulate in the jazz clubs and the pool halls. Did you hear? They tried to drown him. He walked out of the river like he was baptized. Bumpy Johnson, ever the strategist, used this narrative. He didn't confirm if the associate was alive or dead. He let the police wonder. He knew that uncertainty breeds mistakes. A paranoid cop is a sloppy cop. A sloppy cop leaves paper trails, makes frantic phone calls, and meets in places they shouldn't. Bumpy had eyes everywhere: doormen, shushin boys, bartenders. He began to map the network of the officers involved in the attempt. He was building a file, just like the one he would later use to expose Detective Walsh in the Sadie Mae Washington case. This brings us to the broader machinery of corruption that Bumpy was fighting. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was systemic. The numbers game generated millions of dollars annually. It was the lifeblood of Harlem, funding legitimate businesses like beauty salons, funeral homes, and newspapers. The police knew this. They wanted a cut. The pad, the list of officers on the payroll, was extensive. But Bumpy Johnson represented a limit to their greed. He drew a line. You could tax the game, but you couldn't abuse the people. The river incident was a violation of that line. It was an act of disrespect, and Bumpy took disrespect personally. His reaction wasn't immediate violence, which would have brought the National Guard down on Harlem. Instead, he engaged in what we can call gangster civil disobedience. The most famous example of this, echoing the defiance of the river survivor, was his 1965 sit-down strike. Imagine the scene. December 1965, the height of the civil rights era. Martin Luther King is marching. Malcolm X has been assassinated months prior. The streets are hot. And here is Bumpy Johnson, a man the FBI considers a menace, walking into a police station not in handcuffs, but in a wool coat and a fedora. He walks past the desk sergeant. He walks into the commander's office area, and he sits down. "Mr. Johnson, you can't be here," an officer likely said. "I'm staying." Bumpy would have replied, "You've been following me. You've been harassing my family. You've been trying to drown my friends. So if you want me, here I am. Lock me up or leave me alone." He refused to leave. He staged a one-man protest against police surveillance. It was brilliant. If they dragged him out, they looked like bullies. If they arrested him, they had to prove cause. They arrested him for refusal to leave. A judge, perhaps realizing the absurdity of the charge, or perhaps respecting the sheer audacity of the move, acquitted him. Bumpy walked out of that courtroom a victor. He had used the legal system, the white man's system, to beat the white man's enforcers. This legal victory was connected spiritually to the river escape. Both were instances where the system tried to engulf a black man, and the black man found the open window. In the river, it was a literal window. In the police station, it was a loophole in the law. Bumpy was showing his community that you didn't have to just take the abuse. You could outsmart it. But Bumpy's intellect wasn't formed in a vacuum. It was sharpened by his association with the sharpest mind of the generation, Malcolm X. The relationship between Bumpy and Malcolm is the emotional core of this story. They were the prince and the king. Malcolm X, formerly Malcolm Little, knew the streets. He had been Detroit Red. He knew the hustlers, the pimps, the thieves. When he converted to the Nation of Islam, he cleaned up his life, but he never looked down on the men he left behind. He understood them. Forrest Whitaker, who researched this relationship deeply for his role, noted that Malcolm and Bumpy were best friends. This friendship was dangerous for both of them. For Malcolm, associating with a known gangster could discredit his movement. For Bumpy, associating with a radical troublemaker brought extra heat from the FBI. Yet they stayed close. Why? Because they saw the same enemy. When the police dropped Bumpy's friend in the river, Malcolm would have seen it as proof of the system's irredeemable nature. "You see, Bumpy," he might have said, "they don't respect our lives. We have to build our own nation." Bumpy, in turn, provided the muscle that allowed Malcolm to speak his truth. When the Nation of Islam threatened Malcolm, it was Bumpy's men who stood guard. It was a symbiotic relationship between street power and moral authority. The tragedy of the river incident is that it foreshadowed the tragedy of Malcolm himself. Both involved a failure of protection. The associate in the river survived because of his own quick thinking. Malcolm did not. When Malcolm was gunned down in the Audubon Ballroom in 1965, Bumpy was devastated. The show Godfather of Harlem depicts a scene where Bumpy visits Malcolm's body in the morgue. It is a moment of quiet, crushing realization. The prince was gone. The dream of going legit, of leaving the rackets and using his mind for the movement, died on that table. With his best friend gone, we embark on a new journey, Whitaker explains. For Bumpy, that new journey was a lonely one. He had lost his intellectual equal. He had lost the man who understood the burden of leadership. And he was left with a Harlem that was changing for the worse. The heroin epidemic, blue magic, was on the horizon. The code of honor was evaporating. This brings us to the tragic contrast of the next generation. If Bumpy Johnson was the master of the open window, the subtle, life-saving adjustment, then Frank Lucas was the master of the closed tom. Lucas, who claimed to learn everything from Bumpy, seemingly missed the most important lesson: humility. Frank Lucas, a country boy from North Carolina, came to Harlem with a chip on his shoulder and a hunger for power that was insatiable. He told stories of seeing the KKK murder his cousin, a trauma that fueled his life of crime. He worked his way up, eventually bypassing the Italian mob to source heroin directly from Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. It was a logistical masterstroke. He was smuggling, blue magic, heroin in the false bottoms of coffins, myth he perpetuated, or in furniture. He was making millions. But Frank Lucas didn't have Bumpy's discipline. Bumpy moved in silence. Lucas wanted to be a star, and this desire for stardom led to his own, one mistake. A mistake so visually loud, so tactically stupid, that it undid an empire worth millions. The year was 1971. The event was the fight of the century, Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. Every hustler, every star, every politician was there. Bumpy Johnson, had he been alive and present, would have worn a dark suit. He would have sat in a good seat, but not the best seat. He would have blended in. Frank Lucas showed up wearing a chinchilla coat, a full-length 100 Zalausen chinchilla fur coat, with a matching hat. It was a clown suit. It was a neon sign that screamed, "I have illegal money." The police detectives attending the fight, men who had been hunting drug lords for years, looked at the ringside seats better than Frank Sinatra's, and saw a black man they didn't recognize wearing a coat that cost more than their houses.
"Who is that?"
they asked. And just like that, the investigation began. Frank Lucas later admitted it was a massive mistake. He said he left that fight a marked man. Just like the corrupt cops at the river made the mistake of leaving the window down, Frank Lucas made the mistake of putting the coat on. Both errors were born of arrogance. The cops were arrogant enough to think they didn't need to check the body. Lucas was arrogant enough to think he was untouchable. Bumpy Johnson's one mistake, philosophy was vindicated by history. The man who stays quiet, the man who checks the window, the man who wears the dark suit, he survives. The man who flexes, who skips the details, who wears the chinchilla, he falls. As the 1970s rolled on, the Harlem that Bumpy built disintegrated. The heroin that Lucas and others pumped into the streets destroyed the very community Bumpy had tried to protect. The numbers game, which had kept money in the neighborhood, was replaced by a drug trade that sucked the life out of it. The police corruption morphed from policy squad, payoffs to massive drug theft and reselling. But the legend of the river incident remained. It became a parable in the underworld. It was a story told to young soldiers to teach them the importance of being thorough. You want to take someone out, you make sure the window is up, you make sure the body is there. Because if you make one mistake, just one, the ghost will come back to haunt you. And for the officers who drove that car into the Schuylkill, the ghost did haunt them. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to kill them to destroy them. He exposed them. He made them look incompetent. He made them look weak. In the world of the streets, being weak is a death sentence. In the final section of our analysis, we will look at the specific fallout for the officers involved, drawing on the narrative style of the Sadie Mae Washington case to visualize how Bumpy Johnson might have exacted his justice. Not with a gun, but with the truth, weaponized and delivered with the precision of a poet. To understand the full impact of the one mistake at the river, that open window that allowed a man to vanish, we must look at how Bumpy Johnson translated that survival into a political weapon. The police had tried to erase a problem in the dark, but by failing to secure the tome, they created a martyr who was still walking the streets. Bumpy knew that violence would only bring down the full weight of the National Guard, so he chose a battlefield where his intellect could outmaneuver their brute force. He chose the precinct house itself. The date was December 1965. The location was the 28th precinct in Harlem, the fortress of the very men who had authorized the drop at Kelly Drive. It was 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. Bumpy Johnson put on his best suit, a charcoal gray wool that signaled business, not war. He adjusted his fedora and walked through the front doors of the station. The desk sergeant, a man accustomed to dragging suspects in by their collars, looked up in confusion. Bumpy wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't bleeding. He was calm. He walked past the booking desk, past the holding cells that smelled of bleach and misery, and walked straight into the commander's waiting area. And then he sat down. He crossed his legs. He unfolded a newspaper, and he waited. An officer approached him, hand resting nervously on his baton. "Mr. Johnson, you can't be here. If you have business, state it. If not, get out." Bumpy didn't look up from his paper. "I'm staying," he said. His voice was low, the rumble of a subway train before it hits the station. "You boys have been following me. You've been parking outside my home. You've been harassing my family. You've been driving my friends to the river. So, if you want me so bad, here I am. I'm not leaving until you charge me or you stop the surveillance." The officer didn't know what to do. This was the gangster civil disobedience that defined Bumpy's later years. He was turning the precinct into a stage. By 11:00 a.m., the commander came out, face red, veins bulging. "Get him out of here!" he shouted. But how? If they dragged him out, they looked like thugs attacking an old man in a suit. If they let him stay, they looked weak. They chose the mistake. They arrested him. The charge was refusal to leave a police station. A charge so legally flimsy it was practically an admission of defeat. When the case went to court, Bumpy's lawyer tore it apart. A citizen has a right to be in a public building. A citizen has a right to protest harassment. The judge, perhaps seeing the absurdity of the police trying to ban a man from turning himself in, acquitted Bumpy of all charges. It was a humiliation for the NYPD. It was a victory that echoed the "Rever job," just as the open window had allowed the associate to escape the physical trap. Bumpy's knowledge of the law allowed him to escape the legal trap. He proved that the blue wall of silence had cracks, and if you pressed hard enough, the whole thing would crumble. This wasn't just about crime, it was about dignity. It was about showing Harlem that you didn't have to bow down to the badge, especially when the badge was tarnished by corruption and racism. But this defiance came from a place of deep, personal pain. To understand the hardened resolve of 1965 Bumpy Johnson, you have to look at the empty chair at his dinner table. You have to look at the loss of his prince. The relationship between Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson, and Malcolm X was one of the most complex alliances in American history. They were the two kings of Harlem. One ruled the underworld, the other ruled the spiritual and political consciousness. On the surface, they were opposites. Malcolm X preached against the very vices. Gambling, liquor, drugs. That funded Bumpy's empire. Yet, beneath the surface, they were brothers. They shared a common enemy. The systemic oppression that kept their people in chains, whether those chains were made of iron or poverty. Forrest Whitaker, who brought this dynamic to life in Godfather of Harlem, noted that with Malcolm gone, Bumpy was forced to embark on a new journey. But before the journey ended, there was the friendship. Bumpy provided what Malcolm lacked: raw, physical security. When the Nation of Islam turned on Malcolm, when the threats began to come not from the police, but from his own former brothers, it was Bumpy Johnson who stepped in. He offered his soldiers to stand guard. He used his network to track the threats. Malcolm, in turn, offered Bumpy a path to redemption. He constantly urged Bumpy to go legit, to use his brilliant mind, the mind that could quote Shakespeare and win chess tournaments in Alcatraz, to build the community rather than exploit it. The tragedy is that Bumpy was listening. The incident at the river, the constant police harassment, it was all pushing him toward Malcolm's vision. He was tired. He had spent half his life in cages. He wanted peace. But peace is a luxury that Harlem rarely afforded its kings. February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom, the day the music stopped. When the gunmen stood up and opened fire, ending the life of Malcolm X, they didn't just kill a leader, they killed Bumpy Johnson's hope. Stories from the time say that Bumpy was devastated, the man who had survived the War of the Five Boroughs and the 40 murders of the Dutch Schultz era was brought to his knees by the death of his friend. He went to the morgue. He looked at the body of the man who had tried to save his soul. And in that cold room, surrounded by the smell of formaldehyde and death, Bumpy Johnson hardened. The prince was gone. The dream of going legitimate, of fighting with words and ideas, seemed to die on that gurney. If they could kill Malcolm, the most righteous man in Harlem, what chance did a gangster have? The river incident had taught Bumpy that the police were sloppy, but the assassination taught him that the world was cruel. This grief transformed into a cynical pragmatism. Bumpy retreated into his fortress. He continued to run the numbers, continued to manage the streets, but the joy was gone. The sit-down strike, in December 1965, months after Malcolm's death, was the act of a man who had nothing left to lose. He was challenging the system because he no longer feared it. He had seen the worst it could do. But as Bumpy entered his twilight years, a new shadow was lengthening across Harlem, a shadow that didn't care about community or poetry or the delicate balance of power. This shadow wore a smile and carried a kilo of heroin. This shadow was Frank Lucas. If Bumpy Johnson was the Old Testament, stern, codified, rooted in a specific morality, Frank Lucas was the apocalypse. Lucas, a country boy from North Carolina who had migrated to Harlem, claimed to be Bumpy's right hand. He told anyone who would listen that he was Bumpy's driver for 15 years, that he learned everything at the master's feet. Historians and street guys dispute this. They say Lucas was a flunky, a hanger on who exaggerated his closeness to the boss to build his own legend. But whether he was the driver or just a student watching from the cheap seats, Lucas studied Bumpy. He saw the power, he saw the respect, but he missed the most important lesson. He missed the lesson of the open window. Bumpy Johnson's survival was predicated on silence. Move in silence, he would say. The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. Bumpy drove modest cars. He didn't flash cash. He understood that visibility was a liability. The police officers at the river made a mistake because they were arrogant. They didn't check the window because they assumed they had won. Bumpy never assumed he had won. He played the game as if he were always one move away from checkmate. Frank Lucas, however, was different. He saw the money Bumpy made and wanted to scream it from the rooftops. When Bumpy died of a heart attack in 1968 at the Wells restaurant, clutching his chest, the era of the gentleman gangster ended. The era of blue magic began. Frank Lucas took over the void Bumpy left, but he filled it with a poison Bumpy had tried to control. Lucas bypassed the Italian mob, flying to Southeast Asia to source heroin directly from the Golden Triangle. He flooded Harlem with blue magic, a product that was 10.12% pure compared to the street standard of 5%. He made millions. He claimed to make $1 million a day. But with the money came the ego. And with the ego came the second mistake. The mistake that mirrors the open window at the river. The mistake that proves Bumpy's philosophy was right all along. The date was March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. The entire world was watching. Celebrities, politicians, and the power players of New York were in the stands. Frank Sinatra was there. Diana Ross was there. And sitting ringside, in seats better than Sinatra's, was Frank Lucas. But it wasn't just where he sat, it was what he wore. Frank Lucas arrived wearing a chinchilla coat, a floor-length, the 100,000 coat made of chinchilla fur, with a matching hat. It was a spectacle. It was a neon sign screaming, "I have illegal money!" Detectives from the narcotics squad, men who had been hunting ghosts in Harlem for years, looked at the ringside seats. They saw this man, a man they didn't recognize as a legitimate businessman or a celebrity, wearing a coat that cost more than their pensions. Detective Richie Roberts was one of them. He looked at the coat, then he looked at the man. "Who is that?" he asked. And just like that, the investigation began. That coat was Frank Lucas's open window. It was the detail that betrayed him. Bumpy Johnson would have worn a dark suit. Bumpy would have sat 10 rows back. Bumpy would have left the arena unnoticed. Frank Lucas wanted to be the king, but he dressed like the court jester. He later admitted in his memoir and interviews that wearing that coat was a massive mistake. He left that fight a marked man. The parallel between the river job and the chinchilla incident is the thread that ties the history of Harlem crime together. In both cases, a failure of operational security led to disaster. For the corrupt cops at the river, the failure to check the window meant their victim survived to haunt them. For Frank Lucas, the failure to blend in meant the police found a target they couldn't miss. Bumpy Johnson stood between these two eras as the master of the check. He checked the windows. He checked his ego. And because of that, he died a free man in a restaurant, not in a cage or a river. The legacy of the river incident extends beyond the survival of one associate. It exposed the rot in the NYPD, a rot that Bumpy exploited until his dying day. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the buffer between the police and the community evaporated. The policy squads that had once just collected bribes now became active participants in the drug trade. The corruption that led to the attempt on the associate's life metastasized into the systemic predatory policing of the 1970s, where officers would steal drugs from dealers and resell them, a practice Frank Lucas later exposed when he turned informant. Yes, the final irony of the Frank Lucas story is that the man who ignored Bumpy's code of silence eventually broke the ultimate code. He snitched. After being arrested in 1975, facing 70 years in prison, Lucas turned state's evidence. He gave up the names of corrupt cops and fellow gangsters. He destroyed the very ecosystem Bumpy had built. Bumpy Johnson went to Alcatraz rather than talk. He sat in solitary confinement for years, reading history books and writing poetry, rather than give up a single name. Frank Lucas, faced with the consequences of his chinchilla mistake, gave up everyone. The river runs through all of this. The Schuylkill, the East River, the Hudson. They are the silent witnesses to the history of the underworld. They hold the secrets of the men who didn't check the windows. But the story of Bumpy Johnson's friend, the one who didn't drown, the one who swam away in the dark, is a reminder that the system is not invincible. It makes mistakes. It leaves windows down. And if you are smart enough, if you are tough enough, and if you have a friend like Bumpy Johnson watching your back, you can swim through that window and live to tell the tale. As we close the file on the river incident, we must acknowledge the broader cost. The violence, the drugs, the corruption. It destroyed families. It destroyed neighborhoods. Bumpy Johnson was a hero to some, a villain to others, but he was undeniably a man of his time, a man who refused to be drowned. In the end, the one mistake wasn't just about a car. It was about underestimating the resilience of a people who had been swimming against the current for 400 years. Bumpy Johnson knew the current was strong, but he also knew that if you kept your head up and kept your eyes open, you could always find a way to the shore. This is the lesson of Kelly Drive. This is the lesson of the 28th Precinct. And this is the lesson of the chinchilla coat. In the game of life and death, the details matter. The window matters. The silence matters. And Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, was the master of them all,